Recent discoveries made by scientists studying the ways in which our planet works are surely of the greatest importance for all of us.
The story of the Ice Age begins long before the first mammoth walked the frozen plains. Billions of years ago, Earth was a warm and restless planet, wrapped in clouds of steam and scattered oceans. Yet slowly, over millions of years, the balance began to shift. Continents drifted apart, volcanoes quieted, and the sky itself began to change. Carbon dioxide, the invisible blanket that once trapped the sun's warmth, started to thin. Oceans absorbed more of it, and plants locked it away deep underground. As the air cleared, sunlight began to bounce back into space, and the planet's warmth started to fade. Mountains rose higher as tectonic plates collided, their peaks scraping against the thin blue sky. As they grew, they changed the flow of wind and rain. Snow began to fall more often, and with each winter that came, a little more of it stayed. What once melted now froze solid, year after year, stacking layers of white across the highlands. Soon, vast sheets of ice began to spread outward like a living force. They crept down from the poles, inch by inch, crushing forests, carving mountains, and grinding the earth beneath them into dust. Rivers turned to frozen veins. The oceans sank lower as water became trapped in the ice. Entire continents were locked in a silent, frozen grip. In this growing chill, life was forced to adapt or vanish. Warm-blooded creatures huddled closer, evolving thicker fur and layers of fat. Plants retreated to the edges of survival, clinging to rare valleys untouched by the cold. But even in this desolate world, life found a way. Beneath the endless snow, the heartbeat of the planet still pulsed. Volcanoes deep underground rumbled faintly, their heat seeping through cracks in the ice. The oceans, though colder than ever, continued to flow, carrying warmth from the equator to the poles. It was this fragile balance between fire and frost that would decide Earth's fate. Scientists call these frozen eras the Pleistocene epoch, a time that began around 2.6 million years ago. But the first hints of global freezing came even earlier, during what geologists call the snowball Earth, periods when the planet may have been almost entirely covered in ice from pole to equator. Imagine standing there then, the sky pale and thin, the ground shimmering with frozen crystal, and the sun a distant white disk offering no comfort. Yet, even in this extreme world, microscopic life endured, breathing oxygen beneath the ice, waiting for warmth to return. And when it finally did, the Earth thawed just enough to begin the cycle again. Ice advanced, then retreated, again and again, in rhythm with the planet's heartbeat, a cycle shaped by the tilt of the Earth, the pull of the Moon, and the slow dance of continents drifting across oceans. The stage was set for the creatures that would define this age, the giants of the cold, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves would soon emerge, ruling this frozen kingdom. But before their reign, Earth had to survive the greatest freeze it had ever known. The planet had changed forever. The warmth that once ruled the world was gone, and a new age had begun, an age of ice. As the Earth slipped deeper into cold, the air itself began to change. The winds grew sharper, carrying flakes of ice that glittered beneath a pale, distant sun. What began as scattered snow on mountain peaks soon became something far greater, the breath of ice sweeping across the world. In the far north, snow piled endlessly, layer upon layer. Each winter pressed down upon the last, compacting into solid sheets of glacial ice. These frozen titans began to move, slowly and silently. like living mountains of crystal. Inch by inch, they crept across the land, carving valleys, crushing rocks, and reshaping continents. The northern hemisphere transformed first. North America was buried beneath an enormous sheet of ice that stretched from the Arctic to what is now New York. Europe, too, was swallowed by glaciers, and even Asia's Great Plains turned to frozen tundra. The world was locked beneath white silence. As the ice spread, it reflected more of the sun's rays back into space, making the planet even colder, a chain reaction that fed on itself. The more the world froze, the faster the ice grew. Oceans retreated as water was trapped in the glaciers. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters, exposing ancient coastlines and land bridges between continents. The rhythm of life began to shift with the advancing cold. Forests shrank and gave way to endless stretches of frozen grassland, what scientists now call the Mammoth Steppe. It was a vast ecosystem stretching from Europe to Siberia, and across the Bering Land Bridge into North America, it became home to some of the most resilient creatures that ever lived. Beneath the ice, the planet still breathed. Geysers erupted through cracks in the frozen crust, releasing steam and heat into the bitter air. The Earth's molten core continued to churn, keeping the oceans beneath a thin veil of ice alive. Fish, crustaceans, and ancient whales still swam beneath the frozen surface, unaware of the world above. But for the land dwellers, survival was a test of endurance. Every creature, from the smallest shrew to the towering mammoth, was shaped by the ice. Thick fur coats, layers of fat, and slow-burning metabolisms became essential tools. Only those who could master the cold would endure. Storms raged across the tundra, sculpting the ice into jagged peaks and sweeping plains. Each gust of wind carried frozen dust, remnants of crushed rock ground beneath glaciers. Over thousands of years, these winds built the very soil that would one day feed human civilizations. Deep within the glaciers, air bubbles trapped ancient memories of the atmosphere. Today, scientists extract these icy records, reading the story of Earth's climate frozen in time. They reveal not just cold, but rhythm cycles of ice advancing and retreating tied to the planet's orbit and tilt. And through these cycles, the breath of ice continued. When warmth returned, glaciers melted, rivers burst, and life flourished, but the warmth never lasted. The ice always came back stronger, heavier, hungrier. As the Earth entered the height of its frozen era, the world became both brutal and beautiful. The sky shimmered with auroras as charged particles danced over frozen continents. Beneath them, herds of mammoths and woolly rhinoceros wandered through the snow-covered plains, guided by instinct and memory. This was the age of endurance. An age where every heartbeat, every breath, was a battle against the cold, and yet life did not surrender. It adapted, evolved, and thrived, preparing for the next great chapter in the story of ice. The world was frozen, but it was alive. And in that frozen world, the true giants were about to rise. In the heart of this frozen world, life refused to vanish. Instead, it grew larger, stronger, and wiser. From the endless white plains emerged the rulers of the ice creatures built for survival, carved by the cold itself. Across the vast tundra, the ground trembled beneath the slow march of mammoths. Towering 3 meters tall and weighing over 6 tons, they were the architects of this frozen age. Their curved tusks stretched outward like ivory scythes, and their thick, woolly coats rippled with every step. These were no ordinary elephants. They were the descendants of tropical ancestors, transformed by millions of years of ice and wind. The Mammoth Steppe was their kingdom, stretching from Spain to Siberia, from Alaska to Canada. In this cold paradise, temperatures often dropped below -40, yet the mammoths thrived. Their blood was thick and warm, their fur dense enough to resist blizzards, and beneath their skin lay a layer of fat, nearly a foot thick, nature's armor against death by cold. But the mammoths were not alone. Alongside them wandered herds of woolly rhinoceros, covered in long, shaggy hair and equipped with massive horns for sweeping snow to reach buried grass. Musk oxen trudged through icy winds, and steppe bison grazed in massive numbers, shaking frost from their beards as they searched for food. Predators lurked in the shadows, saber-toothed cats with fangs like daggers, stalking the edges of herds. Dire wolves running in disciplined packs, strong enough to bring down beasts many times their size. And cave lions, enormous hunters that ruled the frozen forests. It was a world of titans, a constant struggle where every meal was earned through patience and blood. Yet, despite the violence of survival, the balance of nature remained perfect. The mammoths were not merely victims of this world, they were its engineers. As they roamed, they knocked down trees, spread seeds, and churned up frozen soil, keeping the tundra alive and fertile. Without them, the land would have grown stagnant and dead. Each season brought its own rhythm. In spring, the ice softened, and rivers of meltwater cut through the snow, exposing patches of grass. Birds migrated from the south, and the air filled with the calls of life returning. By summer, the tundra bloomed in color, a brief, brilliant burst of flowers and moss. Mammoth calves were born in these months, taking their first trembling steps beside their mothers. But soon the warmth would fade. By autumn, the wind sharpened again, and herds began to move south. Snow fell endlessly, blanketing the world once more. And when the long winter returned, the giants huddled close, their warm breaths forming clouds in the frozen air. Scientists today uncover their bones, perfectly preserved in the permafrost. Inside, the frozen blood still carries the secrets of their world. DNA studies reveal how these animals adapted to the cold, thicker hair, oxygen-efficient blood, and special fat cells designed to release heat. They were not just survivors, they were masterpieces of evolution. Still, even the mightiest had limits. Predators grew hungrier as prey became scarce, and competition for food intensified. The giants of the cold faced not only nature's wrath, but also a new, clever rival, one that hunted in groups, used tools, and could think ahead. The arrival of early humans would change everything. The balance that had endured for millennia was about to shift. The age of mammoths would soon collide with the rise of man. The world of the Ice Age was ruled not by kings or empires of men, but by the silent dominion of mammoths. Their herds were the heartbeat of the tundra, vast, slow-moving waves of life that shaped everything they touched when they walked. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their weight. For thousands of years, these giants roamed freely across the northern world, from the frozen plains of Siberia to the open grasslands of North America. They migrated with the rhythm of the seasons. They followed the melting snow, the winds, and the promise of food. Their trails stretched across continents, carved deep into the earth invisible highways that connected an ancient icy world. The mammoths were not aimless wanderers. Their migrations helped life endure. When they fed, they tore up old vegetation, letting new plants grow. When they moved, their heavy steps churned frozen soil, releasing trapped nutrients. And when they died, their bodies nourished the ground, feeding generations to come. In every sense, they were the gardeners of the Ice Age. Their society was complex, built on memory and care. Female mammoths led the herds, guiding the young through blizzards and across frozen rivers. They remembered safe paths, hidden valleys, and ancient waterholes passed down through generations. Their bonds were strong. When one fell, others stood guard, mourning their dead with quiet, patient stillness. Males often lived solitary lives, wandering the tundra alone once they reached maturity. Yet even they followed the same eternal rhythm, seeking food, shelter, and survival in a world of endless winter. Their tusks grew longer each year, curling into majestic spirals that marked their age and strength. Some tusks stretched more than 4 meters, heavy enough to shape the snow as they walked. To predators, a mammoth was both a challenge and a prize. Saber-toothed cats and cave lions rarely hunted full-grown adults. Instead, they waited for the young, the weak, or the old who had fallen behind. Still, even wounded, a mammoth could defend itself with terrifying power. A single charge could crush bones, shatter ice, and send predators fleeing into the snow. In caves scattered across Europe, the first humans left paintings of mammoths. They drew them with care, not as monsters, but as gods of survival, symbols of endurance and strength. The mammoth was food, shelter, and warmth. Its tusks became weapons and art. Its bones, the frames of huts. Its fat, fuel for fire. Without the mammoth, human survival in the Ice Age would have been nearly impossible. These ancient bonds between man and beast were woven deep into the story of the ice. Yet, while humans admired and depended on them, the climate around both began to shift again. Slowly, the Earth's orbit tilted, and warmth began to return. Ice that had held the world hostage for millennia started to melt. Rivers swelled, lakes overflowed, and the grasslands that once fed the mammoths began to shrink. Forests crept northward, replacing open tundra with dense woods, a place where giants could no longer roam freely. The Mammoth Empire was beginning to break apart. Still, in the final centuries of their reign, they remained magnificent. Mammoths walked the plains of Europe as the pyramids of Egypt's ancestors were still a dream. Herds thundered through Alaska long before the first cities rose, and on the remote island of Rangel, a few small mammoths continued to live long after the rest had vanished, a lost echo of a frozen empire. Their time was ending, but their legacy was immortal. Buried in the ice, they waited, their fur intact, their tusks gleaming, their eyes still holding the glint of a world long gone. And through them, the story of the Ice Age would be remembered forever. The Mammoth Empire had ruled the cold, but now new rulers had arrived, creatures with fire, tools, and intelligence. The hunters had come. As the Ice Age reached its peak, a new kind of being emerged from the shadows of survival, one unlike anything the frozen world had seen before. They were fragile compared to the giants around them, yet they carried something far more powerful than strength or fur. They carried intelligence. These were the hunters, the early humans, stepping into a world ruled by ice and giants. They came from Africa long before the cold tightened its grip, spreading slowly across continents, following herds and rivers. As they journeyed north, they faced a planet that tested every breath. The winds could strip flesh from bone, nights could kill with cold, and food was scarce. Yet somehow they endured. Fire was their first ally, a flicker of warmth against the endless dark. With it, they cooked, protected, and survived. They crafted tools from bone and stone, shaping blades sharp enough to pierce even the thick hide of a mammoth. Spears, tipped with flint, became extensions of their will. They hunted together, planned together, and learned to think like predators. Every hunt was a gamble between life and death, One mistake could mean starvation, one victory could mean survival for an entire tribe. Their greatest challenge stood before them in the form of the woolly mammoth. To the humans, it was everything: food, shelter, and spirit. Its meat could feed a family for months, its bones formed the walls of huts, and its tusks became tools, ornaments, and weapons. Even its sinew served as thread for clothing. To hunt such a beast required courage, patience, and unity. In the open tundra, the hunters waited. They studied the herds, learned their movements, and understood their patterns. They used fire and noise to drive mammoths toward hidden pits or narrow valleys where escape was impossible. Then came the spears, dozens of them, striking in unison. And when the giant finally fell, the tundra echoed with victory. But the bond between human and mammoth was not only built on blood. Inside caves across Europe, the hunters painted scenes of mammoths, bisons, and lions on walls illuminated by flickering firelight. They captured the beauty of the world they fought to survive in, not just as prey, but as equals in a shared struggle. These paintings, still visible today in places like Lascaux and Chauvet, are silent messages from a time when humans stood side by side with giants. The hunters adapted quickly to their world. They learned to sew hides into warm clothing, to build shelters from bones and snow, and to follow herds across frozen plains. Their children grew up listening to the sound of wind against mammoth hide tents and the distant calls of wolves across the ice. Their minds expanded with every generation. They began to carve small figures, the first symbols of belief. They looked at the stars and wondered. They buried their dead with care, leaving offerings of tools, shells, and carved animals. In this frozen world, the first sparks of humanity's spirit began to burn. But their success came at a cost. With sharper tools and better tactics, the hunters grew more efficient. Mammoth herds that had ruled for ages now faced an enemy that did not fight with claws or teeth, but with intelligence and persistence. The hunters took only what they needed, but as their numbers grew, the balance began to tip. For now, the world still belonged to the ice, mammoths still roamed, and the tundra still stretched to the horizon. But deep within the hearts of these early humans, something unstoppable had awakened the will to conquer. The first fires of civilization were flickering in the cold, faint but eternal. Soon, the ice itself would begin to retreat, and the world would change forever. The hunters had arrived, and with them, the end of an era had begun. The frozen world had no mercy. The ice stretched endlessly across the horizon, swallowing mountains, rivers, and valleys beneath its pale weight. It was a time when every heartbeat, every breath, was a struggle between life and extinction. In this vast wilderness, the rules of survival were written not by strength alone, but by adaptation, by the will to endure when everything else surrendered to the cold. Winter was not a season anymore, it was an age. The sky hung low and grey for months, the sun a dim ghost drifting behind walls of snow. Winds screamed across the plains, sculpting the earth into ridges of frozen dust. The cold was not merely felt, it lived, crept into bone, into marrow, into the hearts of those who walked this frozen land. For the creatures that inhabited this world, existence meant movement. To stay still was to die. Mammoths moved in great herds across the steppe, their heavy feet pressing down snow that glittered under faint light. Each herd followed ancient paths, guided by memory older than civilization itself. They sought the rare valleys where the wind blew gentle and the earth revealed small patches of frozen grass. They were the architects of life in a world ruled by death. Following them from a distance came the hunters. Men and women, wrapped in animal hides, faces crusted with frost, eyes sharp and patient. They moved silently, blending into the white wilderness. For them, survival depended not on power, but on timing, intelligence, and unity. They carried spears tipped with stone, their tools forged from patience and necessity. Their fires burned small and hidden, flickering in caves or behind walls of snow. Every hunt was a story written in risk. When a mammoth fell, it meant life for an entire tribe. Meat to eat, fat to burn, bones to build with, hides to clothe the living. But to bring one down demanded courage greater than fear. The hunters would wait for days, sometimes weeks, watching from afar, studying the herd, sensing weakness. The old, the sick, or the injured were their only chances. A single mistake, a broken spear, a startled herd could mean death for all. As the humans planned their hunts, other predators stalked the frozen plains. The saber-toothed cat moved with silent grace, its long fangs glinting like ivory blades. It could wait motionless for hours before launching itself at its prey with the precision of a storm. Nearby, packs of dire wolves followed the herds, reading the land as if it spoke to them. They hunted with discipline, their howls echoing through the icy night. And there were others, cave lions with golden fur thickened by frost, massive short-faced bears towering higher than any man, and scavengers that followed the blood scent of every kill. In this endless cold, nothing was wasted and nothing was safe. The dead fed the living became the dead. Beneath this brutal rhythm, the planet itself was alive. Glaciers continued their slow march, grinding mountains into dust. Rivers of meltwater carved new paths through the ice, and frozen rain sculpted shapes into the earth that would one day become lakes, valleys, and plains. To the creatures that walked upon it, the land seemed eternal, but in truth it was shifting with every passing century. For humans, survival required more than instinct, it required invention. They learned to use fire not just for warmth, but for shaping tools, for hardening spear tips, for warding off predators. They learned to build shelters from bones and snow, wrapping the walls in mammoth hides to trap precious heat. Their minds grew sharper with each generation, their hands more skilled, their understanding of nature more profound. Still, hunger was a constant companion. When food was scarce, tribes turned to frozen carcasses buried beneath the snow. They dug with stone tools and bare hands, carving through ice to reach the meat beneath. Some turned to fishing, breaking through frozen lakes to catch small, cold-water creatures. Others followed migrating herds south, chasing warmth that seemed always just beyond reach. The nights were the hardest. Darkness swallowed the land, and the only light came from the small fires guarded like treasure. Around those fires, humans huddled close, telling stories to fight the silence. They spoke of spirits in the ice, of mammoths that watched over them, of stars that guided the lost. Their myths became comfort, their stories a map of hope. Each dawn brought new trials. Sometimes blizzards came without warning, burying camps in snow and freezing the very air they breathed. Other times, floods erupted from melting glaciers, sweeping away everything in their path. The world changed without pattern, without mercy, and those who could not adapt disappeared into history. In caves scattered across Europe and Asia, early humans left behind traces of their existence, handprints, tools, paintings. On stone walls, they drew what they saw and what they feared. Mammoths, bison, lions, and the hunt. These were not merely drawings, they were memories, lessons, and warnings. In the flicker of torchlight, The hunters looked upon their own art and remembered that they too were part of the great struggle, both predator and prey. Over generations, humans and animals developed an unspoken connection. The hunters followed the herds, learning their habits and migrations. The mammoths, in turn, learned to sense danger, protecting their young by forming circles, their tusks pointed outward like shields of ivory. When wolves appeared, the herds tightened. When humans came, they fled. Yet even as predator and prey, they depended on each other, each shaping the other's destiny. One cold dawn, a mammoth herd stood at the edge of a frozen river. Their breath rose in clouds, their fur dusted with snow. Across the plain, a group of hunters waited, their eyes narrow, their spears ready. The plan had taken days. They had studied the wind, the ground, the movement of ice. The weakest mammoth, an old female with cracked tusks, was chosen. A cry shattered the stillness. Fire and noise filled the air as the hunters drove the herd toward the ice. Panic spread the ground, thundered beneath their charge. The old mammoth slipped, its great weight breaking through the frozen surface. The hunters surged forward, spears flashing. Blood stained the snow. The air filled with the sound of struggle roars, cries, the shattering of ice. When it was over, the hunters stood in silence, their breath steaming in the cold. They knelt beside the fallen giant, touching its fur, whispering thanks. They did not see death as conquest, but as exchange. The mammoth's life meant their survival. In its death, life continued. This was the balance of the Ice Age, fragile, sacred, and fleeting. Months passed, and the seasons shifted again. For a brief moment each year, warmth returned, snow melted into rivers, and the land turned green. Grass spread across the tundra, flowers bloomed, and herds fattened. For animals and humans alike, it was a time of renewal. Children were born, food was gathered, and hope seemed possible. But the warmth never lasted. Soon the sky darkened again, and the breath of winter reclaimed its dominion. Each cycle tested those who remained. Weaker species vanished, stronger ones evolved. Woolly rhinoceros developed horns to sweep snow aside. Musk oxen grew denser coats and traveled in tighter herds. Humans improved their tools, carving new blades from flint, inventing the atlatl, a weapon that allowed them to strike from a distance. And yet, even as life adapted, the pressure of the cold grew heavier. The glaciers expanded once more, sealing off valleys and driving herds toward extinction. Resources dwindled, and competition turned brutal. Wolves fought lions for carcasses. Bears raided human camps. Tribes clashed over hunting grounds, their tools turning from weapons of prey into weapons against each other. Still, amidst the chaos, the spark of human creativity burned brighter. They learned to predict the movement of animals, to read the weather by the color of the sky and the song of the wind. They crafted ornaments from ivory and shells, small symbols of identity and spirit. In a world ruled by survival, they found time to imagine, to dream. Some nights, the aurora danced across the sky, curtains of green and violet shimmering over the ice. The hunters watched in silence, believing the lights to be the souls of the dead rising to the heavens. Even in the harshest times, beauty lingered, fleeting, fragile, but enough to remind them that life was more than survival. Beneath the ice, the planet's heartbeat continued. Volcanic fires rumbled deep underground, releasing plumes of heat into the frozen air. The Earth was preparing for change. Subtle at first, almost invisible, the cold began to weaken. Glaciers stopped advancing. The sun seemed to linger a little longer each day. Animals sensed it before humans did. Migrations changed, new plants sprouted, and the winds softened. But before the thaw could begin, the frozen world unleashed one final fury. Storms raged like never before, blizzards that lasted weeks, winds that could strip flesh from bone. Rivers froze solid, and herds vanished into the white. Tribes were scattered. Countless lives were lost to hunger and frost. The Ice Age was at its cruelest just before it began to end. When the storms finally passed, silence returned, vast and endless. Out of that silence, the survivors emerged, weak, thin, weary, and changed forever. They carried with them the memory of the struggle, etched into their bones and stories. They had endured. In that endurance lay the foundation of everything that would come after every city, every invention, every civilization. Humanity had proven itself not the strongest, but the most adaptable. They learned that survival was not victory over nature, but harmony with it. They had lived alongside mammoths, hunted beside wolves, and endured the wrath of the ice itself. And as the glaciers began to melt, rivers flowed again, feeding green into the grey. The world exhaled, and life returned in waves. Forests spread, animals migrated, and the sky cleared to reveal a sun that finally brought warmth instead of light alone. The great battle for survival was over, but its scars remained carved into the land and the living. Every valley, every mountain, every bone buried beneath the tundra was a witness to that struggle. The ice had shaped them all, beasts and humans alike. And though the world would thaw, the memory of the cold would never leave it. For those who lived through it, the ice was not merely a season of death. It was a teacher, ruthless, patient, eternal. And from its lessons, the story of life would begin again. The Ice Age had forged the survivors of Earth, but as the warmth returned, a new challenge awaited the fall of giants. The northern world was a realm of frozen power, an empire carved not by kings, but by time, pressure, and silence. Here, ice was both the ruler and the sculptor, shaping everything beneath its weight. Mountains disappeared beneath glaciers, valleys filled with frozen rivers, and the sky hung heavy with snow that never melted. This was the true throne of the Ice Age, the Ice Kingdoms of the North, stretching across what we now call Canada, Greenland, Scandinavia, and Siberia. These frozen domains were vast beyond comprehension. The Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets rose like white continents, their peaks higher than any mountain range alive today. They groaned and cracked as they moved, grinding the land beneath them into dust. Each inch of their progress reshaped the world forever. From above, if one could have seen it, the earth would have looked like a living creature wrapped in frozen armor. The ice pulsed and breathed, expanding and retreating in cycles that lasted thousands of years. Beneath its glass-like surface, rivers of blue meltwater flowed through tunnels of darkness, carrying crushed rock toward the sea. The silence of the north was broken only by the sound of movement, slow, deep, and eternal. As glaciers slid forward, they carved canyons, sculpted valleys, and created new lakes that would one day fill with life. Fjords, cliffs, and ridges still visible in the modern world were born here, shaped by the weight of the ancient ice. But this kingdom was not entirely dead. Though it appeared lifeless, the ice was alive with hidden worlds. Inside the glaciers, air bubbles trapped the breath of ancient atmospheres, whispers from an Earth millions of years old. Each bubble carried secrets of temperature, oxygen, and carbon. Today, scientists drill deep into these frozen archives, reading them like a library written by time. and beneath the ice, life found refuge in places where the sun never reached. Strange microbes and bacteria lived in liquid water pockets sealed from the world above, feeding on minerals and chemical reactions rather than sunlight. They were the descendants of the planet's earliest survivors, still clinging to existence in the coldest depths. Above the ice, the winds carried dust from faraway lands, the fine powder of crushed stone blown across continents. When the air was still, the dust settled, coating the snow with faint shades of grey. And when the winds howled again, the dust lifted and danced in spirals, glinting under the faint sun like powdered glass. Across this endless white, few creatures dared to venture. Those that did were built from resilience itself. Arctic foxes, wolves, and polar bears patrolled the frozen edges, scavenging the remains of hunts left by humans or predators. Snow owls hovered silently over the tundra, their feathers blending perfectly with the landscape. And in the brief warmth of summer, migrating birds returned, millions of them, to breed on the thin, fragile patches of thawed land. For the mammoths and other great beasts of the steppe, the north was both a refuge and a trap. During milder centuries, they followed the receding glaciers, grazing on the newly exposed plains. But when the cold returned, they were driven south once again, caught in a cycle that mirrored the heartbeat of the ice itself. And yet, some places in the north defied the cold. Volcanic activity beneath the ice created oases of warmth, geothermal springs surrounded by steam and life. Moss and algae grew there, painting the white with streaks of green. Animals came to drink from the steaming pools, finding momentary relief from the endless frost. Even in the most unforgiving kingdom, warmth found a way to survive. The humans who ventured into these regions faced conditions that no other species could endure. The cold could kill within hours, frostbite within minutes. Yet they came drawn by curiosity, hunger, or migration. They learned to build shelters from snow, creating igloo-like domes that trapped their body heat. They crafted clothing from the hides of mammoths and bears, layering fur upon fur until their bodies were nearly as insulated as the beasts they hunted. For them, the ice was both danger and protection. Predators rarely followed this far north, and the cold preserved food for months. Humans learned to use the land itself as a weapon, freezing their kills to prevent scavengers from stealing, storing them beneath the snow as if in nature's freezer. But survival came with a price: isolation, silence, loneliness. The endless night of the polar regions could last for months, testing not just the body, but the mind. During those dark stretches, people turned inward, their fires burning dimly beneath the aurora. They sang softly, carved figures from bone, and dreamed of the return of the sun. The aurora was the only light that reminded them they were still alive. Shimmering curtains of green and violet rippled across the frozen sky, filling it with silent motion. The hunters believed the lights were spirits' ancestors watching from above, guiding them through the dark. To modern science, they are the dance of charged particles colliding with the atmosphere. But in truth, both stories hold power. For those who watched from the ice, it was not just light, it was hope. Sometimes, entire landscapes disappeared beneath blizzards for weeks. Mountains, rivers, even the horizon itself vanished in white storms so thick they erased the concept of direction. To survive such storms, humans and animals relied on instinct, huddling close, conserving energy, waiting for the fury to pass. Those who panicked did not last long. When the storms cleared, what remained was silence, a stillness so deep it seemed almost sacred. In that silence, The sound of a mammoth's footstep or the crack of distant ice could be heard for miles. The world felt vast, ancient, and alive. Beneath all this beauty, the ice kingdoms held immense power. The weight of the glaciers pressed down upon the continents, deforming the crust of the earth. Even the oceans responded, lowering their levels to fill the void. When the ice melted, the land would rise again, rebounding slowly over thousands of years. The world was constantly breathing in and out, and the ice was its lungs. Over time, the cycles of freezing and thawing shaped not only the landscape, but the destiny of life itself. Animals evolved to match the rhythm. Humans followed the migration of both prey and climate. The world became a mosaic of frozen deserts, icy seas, and thin veins of green where life persisted. And deep within the glaciers, time stood still. Seeds, trapped within the ice, waited for centuries to awaken. Pollen, frozen in place, marked the passing of forgotten seasons. Even the air, trapped inside, told stories of fire, flood, and famine. Millennia later, when scientists drilled into the ice, they discovered these messages, perfectly preserved memories of the Earth's heartbeat. Through them, we learned that the ice kingdoms were not lifeless wastelands, but archives, holding every breath the planet had ever taken. The North was not just a prison of cold, it was a memory of creation. Everything humanity would one day know about climate, time, and life itself lay hidden in these frozen vaults. And yet, the ice kingdoms were not eternal. Cracks began to appear as the world shifted once more. The planet tilted slightly, sunlight returning to places that had known only night. Glaciers began to melt, rivers broke free, and the frozen giants that had ruled for millennia started to retreat. As the ice withdrew, it revealed a new world, one scarred but fertile, a canvas waiting for life to return. Forests began to spread, animals followed, and humans stepped forward into lands no one had ever walked before. The great white empires were dying, but their influence would never fade. Every mountain range, every valley, every coastline we know today was shaped by their touch. The ice kingdoms of the north were ending, but they had left behind a legacy written in stone and memory. They had carved the earth, preserved its past, and prepared it for what was to come. And what was coming next would change everything once again. The balance between cold and warmth was about to break. The climate was shifting, and with it, the destiny of every living creature. The breath of the earth was changing. The glaciers were retreating. The kingdoms of ice were falling, and in their wake, a new world of fire, flood, and life was about to rise. The age of ice was never still. It was a world that breathed in cycles, each inhale bringing frost and silence, each exhale melting the edges of the frozen earth. Though it seemed eternal, the cold was not constant. Deep beneath the calm, the planet's heart still pulsed slow, rhythmic, powerful, guiding the rise and fall of glaciers, the shifting of oceans, and the dance between life and extinction. For millions of years, Earth had been moving through an endless pattern of freezing and thawing. The rhythm was set not by chance, but by the cosmos itself. The planet's orbit was never perfect. It wobbled slightly, tilted and stretched as it circled the sun. These small movements, invisible to the eye, changed everything. When the planet tilted closer to the sun, the ice began to retreat. When it leaned away, the cold returned, spreading its white veil once more. These were the Milankovitch cycles, the hidden clockwork of the Ice Age. Sometimes the changes came slowly, over tens of thousands of years. Other times they struck like lightning, abrupt, violent, unstoppable. One century could be frozen, the next drowning in floods of melted ice. Rivers overflowed their banks, oceans rose, and plains that once echoed with mammoth calls turned into swamps and lakes. The balance that had defined the world began to tremble. At first, life adapted, as it always had. Mammoths moved north in search of colder lands. Humans followed, migrating through continents connected by ice bridges. Wolves, bison, and reindeer roamed freely between Asia and America across the Bering Land Bridge, a vast frozen highway that no longer exists. But as the centuries passed, the warmth grew stronger and the ice began to lose its grip. Beneath the glaciers, enormous lakes formed, trapped under the crushing weight of ice sheets. When the pressure became too great, these lakes burst free with unimaginable force. Walls of water, hundreds of meters high, tore across the land, reshaping valleys, drowning forests, and carving canyons that still scar the earth today. The great floods of North America, born from melting ice, carried enough power to move boulders the size of houses and erase entire landscapes in hours. With every surge of meltwater, the world changed again. Sea levels rose, flooding coastlines and erasing ancient paths used by migrating herds and humans. Lands that once connected continents disappeared beneath the ocean, trapping species in isolation. Islands formed where plains once were. The planet was transforming from a frozen empire into something new, something uncertain. And yet, even as the warmth advanced, the ice fought back. The oceans cooled, reflecting the sun's light into space. Volcanic eruptions darkened the sky with ash, briefly bringing the cold again. It was a tug-of-war between fire and frost, a struggle written in the clouds, the seas, and the soil. In some regions, forests began to grow where tundra once stretched endlessly. Trees rooted themselves in ground that had been frozen for thousands of years, releasing ancient air trapped beneath. The scent of soil returned to the wind, mixing with the faint memory of snow. The sound of insects filled the air once more, and birds returned to lands that had known only silence. But not every creature rejoiced. The mammoths, masters of the cold, found themselves in a changing world that no longer welcomed them. Grasslands turned to forests, and the plants they had relied on vanished. Their great herds dwindled, their migrations broken by floods and trees. Each generation grew smaller, each winter harder than the last. For humans, the shifts brought both opportunity and danger. The same warmth that melted glaciers opened new rivers, valleys, and hunting grounds. Food became more plentiful, but the weather became unpredictable. Droughts struck suddenly, followed by violent storms. Entire regions that had once been fertile turned to desert within a few generations. It was as if the earth was rewriting its own rules, testing the species that had survived its coldest age. The hunters, who had once followed mammoth herds, now faced new challenges. Their prey grew scarce, and their tools changed with the world. They learned to fish in the swelling rivers, to trap smaller animals, and to gather plants from the forests that spread across the land. Slowly, the hunter became a thinker, adapting not just to the cold, but to the shifting moods of the planet itself. Volcanoes, long dormant, awoke as the pressure of melting ice lifted from the crust. They spewed ash and fire into the air, blocking sunlight and cooling the earth for years at a time. These eruptions acted like the Earth's way of correcting itself, slowing the warming just enough to delay the inevitable. But the balance was already broken, and while the surface trembled with chaos, the oceans became the silent witnesses of change. As the ice melted, enormous amounts of fresh water poured into the seas, disrupting ocean currents that had carried warmth around the globe. The Gulf Stream faltered, temperatures plunged, and for a brief moment, barely a heartbeat in geological time, the ice returned. This sudden freeze, known to science as the Younger Dryas, was the Earth's final attempt to hold on to its icy throne. For nearly 1,000 years, the cold came back with fury. Forests died again, rivers froze, and the descendants of the mammoths roamed one last time across a world they could no longer call their own. But then, as suddenly as it had returned, the cold retreated forever. The final thaw began slowly, quietly. Ice melted into streams that carved new rivers through soft earth. Mountains that had been hidden for eons re-emerged, their slopes glistening with water. The air grew heavy with moisture, rain returned to dry plains, and the world exhaled. The Ice Age, the great sculptor of continents, was finally loosening its grasp. The consequences were immense. Entire ecosystems collapsed and reformed within centuries. Animals that had ruled for millennia vanished: the woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, the saber-toothed cat, and soon the mammoth itself. Their extinction was not caused by one single force, but by a chain of events: melting climates, shrinking habitats, and the rise of humans whose skill and ambition grew faster than evolution could follow. For humankind, these shifts marked both an ending and a beginning. The Ice Age had forged their intelligence, their cooperation, their resilience. Now, as the world warmed, they began to settle. Where glaciers had retreated, rivers carved fertile valleys, seeds took root in the rich soil left behind by the ice. For the first time, humans no longer had to chase their food, they could grow it. Civilization was awakening, but the memory of the ice never faded. The people of this new world carried stories of the cold legends of great beasts, of endless winters, of the sky filled with lights that guided the lost. They built myths from the past, worshipping the elements that had once decided their fate. The Ice Age became both warning and wisdom. Scientists today still trace the echoes of those ancient shifts. Deep in the Greenland ice sheet, they read the frozen layers like pages of a vast, silent book. Each layer records a year, each bubble of air a breath from a forgotten atmosphere. They tell of eruptions, storms, floods, and the steady warming that ended the age of ice. The story is clear. The Earth has always changed, always adapted, always survived. But hidden in those layers is another truth, that every shift comes with a price. For each rise in warmth, a species vanishes. For each retreat of ice, a world is lost. The balance of Earth is delicate, and its memory long. As the Ice Age faded, the last of the glaciers glimmered beneath the pale sun, retreating northward like ghosts. Rivers flowed where ice once ruled, carrying fragments of stone and bone toward the sea. Mountains gleamed anew, stripped of their white crowns, and where mammoths once walked, grass grew tall, waving softly in a wind that no longer froze. The ice had withdrawn, but its legacy endured in the shape of continents, in the bones buried beneath the ground, and in the blood of those who survived. It had tested life, and life had answered. The age of ice had ended, but in its passing, it had given birth to a new world, a world of warmth, chaos, and creation. And in the ruins of the frozen kingdoms, something remarkable was about to rise: the fall of giants and the dawn of humankind's dominion over the earth. Beneath the endless white of the Ice Age, hidden far from the wind and storm, there lay another world, a world of silence, darkness, and astonishing life. While the continents froze and herds of mammoths trudged across the tundra, the oceans beneath the ice continued to move, breathe, and pulse with unseen energy. The sea, even in its coldest age, never truly slept. The surface of the oceans was locked under thick layers of ice in the polar regions, sometimes stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Above, the world was silent, broken only by the cracking of glaciers and the groan of pressure. But below, the water was alive, an inverted kingdom ruled by creatures adapted to darkness and cold. Sunlight barely touched these depths. Only the faintest glow filtered through the ice, shimmering like pale ghosts on the water's surface. But even this dim light was enough for tiny beings, phytoplankton, to live and multiply. They were the invisible architects of the ocean's ecosystem, forming the foundation of a food chain that would feed everything from shrimp to whales. Beneath them swam schools of small, silvery fish, darting through the cold currents in synchronized waves. Larger predators followed, ancient sharks, seals with thick coats of blubber, and whales giants of the deep that sang through the cold water in haunting, echoing tones. Their voices traveled for miles, bouncing off the ice, resonating like the heartbeat of the frozen sea. These creatures were shaped not by warmth or abundance, but by scarcity. In the freezing depths, energy was precious, and every movement mattered. Fish slowed their metabolism, conserving strength. Seals developed thicker layers of fat to resist the cold. Whales migrated vast distances, following trails of plankton blooms that appeared only for brief moments each year when the sea ice cracked open to let in light. Each crack in the ice was a window of life. When sunlight broke through, even for a few days, microscopic algae bloomed in explosive bursts of color beneath the frozen surface. These fleeting events fed everything from tiny krill to massive blue whales. And when the light faded again, the ocean returned to its quiet rhythm, waiting patiently for the next brief gift of warmth. The cold shaped everything here. Icebergs the size of cities drifted through the sea, breaking away from glaciers with thunderous roars. Beneath the surface, their roots extended deep into the dark, vast as mountains turned upside down. They scraped the sea floor, crushing coral and carving trenches that would one day become canyons. And when they melted, they released trapped sediments, minerals that nourished the water and fed new life. It was in these depths that evolution took bold and strange turns. In the darkness of the deep sea, where sunlight had never reached, creatures glowed with their own light. Bioluminescent fish drifted like living stars, their bodies flickering blue and green. Jellyfish pulsed through the black water like ghosts, leaving trails of light in their wake. And far below, in the trenches where the pressure was crushing and the temperature near freezing, life took root around vents that spewed heat from the Earth's interior. These hydrothermal vents were islands of warmth in an otherwise frozen world. Here, bacteria fed not on sunlight, but on the chemical energy of the Earth itself, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and minerals rising from the mantle. From these tiny organisms grew entire ecosystems. Blind crabs, giant tube worms, and strange fish that thrived where no light existed. Scientists believe that it was in places like these that life on Earth may have begun billions of years ago, in darkness, in heat, in the embrace of the deep. During the Ice Age, when the surface froze, these hidden realms ensured that life never stopped. While the continents suffered the cold, the oceans carried on, guarding the spark of existence. But the ice did not only shape life beneath the sea, it shaped the oceans themselves. When glaciers expanded, they trapped enormous amounts of water, lowering sea levels across the globe by more than 100 meters. Coastlines retreated, exposing vast stretches of land that connected continents. Ancient plains, now buried beneath the waves, once teemed with life. Mammoths, humans, and wolves walked across what would later become the North Sea, the Bering Strait, and the Sahul Shelf between Asia and Australia. When the glaciers melted, these lands vanished beneath the rising tides. Forests drowned, and rivers became estuaries. Entire ecosystems were swallowed by the returning sea. Yet even in destruction, the ocean created anew. Shallow seas became breeding grounds for fish, coral reefs flourished, and nutrients from melting glaciers fertilized the waters, feeding a surge of marine life. The rhythm of the sea followed the pulse of the ice. When the cold deepened, currents slowed, locking heat away in the depths. When the world warmed, those same currents released it again, spreading energy across the globe. The ocean was the planet's hidden engine, a vast conveyor of temperature, salt, and life. In the North Atlantic, the warm currents met the cold meltwater from the glaciers, creating fogs that drifted endlessly across the horizon. Icebergs floated like islands, carrying with them the frozen memory of the continents. When they finally melted, they left trails of minerals that fed plankton blooms so massive they could be seen from space. These blooms released oxygen into the atmosphere, slowly reshaping the air above. Even from the shadows of the deep, the ocean was breathing life into the planet. Yet beneath its calm surface, danger brewed. As the glaciers melted faster, fresh water poured into the sea, disrupting the delicate balance of salt and temperature that kept the ocean currents alive. Warm water sank where it should have risen, cold currents weakened. This imbalance triggered rapid climate shifts across the world, freezing one region while flooding another. The planet was entering a state of chaos. For the animals of the sea, these changes came swiftly. Whales altered their migration routes, fish vanished from once rich waters, plankton populations collapsed in some places and exploded in others. Species that had thrived for millennia began to disappear. Even the coral reefs, which had survived countless cycles of ice and thaw, began to bleach and crumble as temperatures swung wildly. Humans, though unaware of the deep ocean's turmoil, felt its consequences. Shifting tides flooded their coastal camps, and changes in fish populations forced them to move inland. Storms became fiercer, the air more humid, the balance of nature unpredictable. The sea, once a silent ally, had become restless. And yet, amid all the change, the deep ocean remained a sanctuary. While the surface world froze and melted, fought and fell, the depths endured steady, timeless, eternal. The same creatures that swam beneath the glaciers continued their slow, deliberate dance, untouched by the chaos above. Even as the mammoths vanished from the tundra, the whales still sang beneath the ice. Today, the traces of that ancient world still remain. Deep in the Arctic, beneath layers of modern ice, lie fossils of fish and shells from the Ice Age seas. Trapped within them are records of the chemistry of that time, evidence of how the ocean breathed, warmed, and cooled. Scientists studying these relics can read the story of the climate shifts not from land, but from salt water. And though the glaciers are long gone, the ocean still carries their memory. Every current, every tide, every wave is shaped by the cold ages that once ruled the earth. The oxygen we breathe, the clouds that form above us, the life that fills the seas, all of it still flows in rhythm with the ancient pulse of ice. The frozen oceans were not the end of life, but its secret beginning. They held the planet's last warmth when the surface froze, and they preserved its future when the cold passed. They were the silent guardians of the Earth's story, hidden beneath the weight of time. And as the last ice began to melt, as the seas rose to reclaim the land, the deep answered once again, reshaping continents, rewriting coasts, and carrying life to new shores. The ice above may have melted, but the ocean beneath never stopped moving. It remains, even now, the same endless mystery, cold, vast, and alive. The world above was changing faster than ever. The fire of the earth was beginning to break through the cold once more, setting the stage for the next great turning point, the meeting of two forces that would decide the fate of all life to come. Fire and ice were about to collide. The Ice Age was a symphony of opposites: silence and thunder, death and rebirth, stillness and eruption. While the surface of the planet lay buried beneath endless white, deep beneath the crust, the Earth's heart burned as fiercely as ever. Molten rivers churned miles below, restless, waiting. The frozen continents were not as peaceful as they appeared. They were only sleeping above a world of fire. For millions of years, the Earth had maintained a delicate balance between cold from the sky and heat from within. But now, that balance began to tremble. As the weight of glaciers pressed down on the crust, the molten rock beneath built up unbearable pressure. Cracks formed. Deep fissures opened along the seams of continents. And then, without warning, the ice split open and fire roared through. Volcanoes erupted across the frozen world, spewing ash and smoke into the air. The sky darkened as molten fountains burst through the ice sheets, turning them to clouds of steam. Entire valleys shook, mountains split, and rivers of lava carved glowing paths through the snow. Fire met frost, and the planet shuddered beneath the clash. In Iceland, in Kamchatka, in Alaska, and across Siberia, volcanoes that had slept for ages awoke together. Their eruptions sent millions of tons of ash into the atmosphere, blanketing the sun and cooling the planet once more. The light dimmed, the sky turned red, and snow began to fall heavier than ever before. For years, the temperature plummeted, and even the oceans froze farther south. But this destruction also brought creation. The volcanic ash carried minerals that enriched the soil when it finally settled. What seemed like ruin became nourishment, the dust of rebirth. And from the fusion of fire and ice, strange new landscapes emerged. Towering ice cliffs surrounded steaming craters. Rivers of lava flowed beneath glacial bridges. Geysers erupted where heat met frozen earth. The world looked both alien and divine, a planet rebuilding itself from its own extremes. To the creatures that roamed these lands, this was a time of chaos. Mammoths, reindeer, and bison fled from the volcanic plains, their silhouettes dark against the crimson sky. Birds fell from the ash-choked air, and herds wandered for days, searching for clean water. For humans, it was an era of both terror and transformation. The hunters, who had mastered the ice, now faced a new force they could not predict. Volcanoes erupted near their hunting grounds, burying valleys beneath soot and stone. Yet they adapted. They learned to use volcanic rock obsidian to craft sharper, deadlier tools. Its edges could slice flesh cleaner than bone or flint, giving them weapons unmatched in precision. From destruction, they forged progress. When the skies cleared, the world that emerged was changed. Snowmelt from volcanic heat created massive floods, rivers bursting from glaciers in torrents that reshaped entire continents. Canyons deepened, coastlines shifted, and new islands formed from cooled lava. The planet was not dying, it was transforming, writing a new chapter in its story of survival. Still, the balance between fire and ice was fragile. Each eruption threw ash high into the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight and cooling the earth. But beneath that cooling, the greenhouse gases released from molten rock, carbon dioxide and methane, slowly began to trap heat. The same fire that froze the world was also preparing to warm it. As centuries passed, the heat from below and the warmth from the sun began to align. Glaciers started to retreat faster than ever before. Ice melted into rivers that carried ash and minerals across plains, feeding the growth of plants. Grass spread again, green returning to lands that had not seen color in tens of thousands of years. The world exhaled, heavy and alive. The retreat of the ice awakened volcanoes long buried beneath its weight. As the pressure lifted, magma rose freely, bursting through weakened crusts. The earth released its buried heat in one final surge, as if exhaling after a deep frozen breath. Towering plumes of fire rose over melting glaciers, the final struggle between the forces that had defined the age. And then, slowly, the fire began to win. The global temperature climbed. Oceans thawed, ice sheets shrank, and the great white walls that had covered the poles began to collapse. The planet's reflectivity diminished. More sunlight was absorbed, accelerating the warming. Rivers of meltwater roared into the seas, raising water levels, drowning coastal lands, and reshaping continents once again. The animals adapted or died. Mammoths followed the retreating cold north, but their territory shrank with every century. Saber-toothed cats and direwolves, once kings of the tundra, found fewer and fewer prey. The woolly rhinoceros vanished, unable to survive in the warming plains. Those who had once ruled the age of frost were now ghosts of a dying empire, and while the giants fell, humans endured. They watched the changing world with eyes that saw more than instinct. They learned to read the land, to sense the shifts of weather, the tremors beneath their feet. They found warmth in caves heated by volcanic vents, hunted in forests growing on new soil, and used obsidian from the earth's wounds to carve their survival. The bond between humanity and the planet deepened. They began to see the world not as an enemy, but as a teacher, one that demanded respect and understanding. The fire and the ice had both nearly destroyed them, but they had endured through intelligence, cooperation, and will. Each generation carried the stories of these forces. They told of the great mountain that breathed fire, of the rivers that ran black with ash, of the days when the sky turned red and the stars vanished. Their myths became memory, and their memory became history. As the centuries passed, the duality of fire and ice gave birth to balance. From the ashes of volcanoes grew forests. From the melt of glaciers came rivers that fed valleys. The extremes that had once torn the planet apart now created the conditions for abundance. Life flourished in the aftermath. Beneath the oceans, the fire still burned quietly. Volcanic ridges along the seafloor released minerals that fed entire ecosystems. Hydrothermal vents pulsed with heat, sustaining life even as the surface thawed. The same forces that once threatened to end existence were now the silent architects of its renewal. And while the earth warmed, storms became more violent. Rain heavier, lightning brighter. The planet's atmosphere thickened with water, vapor, and gas, swirling with new energy. Thunder rolled over lands still scarred by ice, echoing across valleys carved by glaciers. The cycle was complete. The age of ice had met the age of fire, and together they forged the world that would belong to humans. The people of this changing earth no longer moved endlessly as hunters. They began to stay to build shelters not from bones, but from stone. They planted seeds in soil rich with volcanic ash, learning that the same ground that once burned could now bring life. Their settlements grew near rivers born from melting ice, where the land was fertile and the climate kind. Civilization was being born from the ashes of extremes. But even as the glaciers melted, reminders of the past remained. In caves buried beneath mountains, ancient ice still slept, holding within it the bubbles of forgotten air. Inside those bubbles were the whispers of the age of frost, the breath of mammoths, the smoke of volcanoes, the frozen sighs of oceans. The story of fire and ice was not gone. It was only buried, waiting for us to remember. Today, the evidence of that eternal battle is etched across every continent. The ridges of Iceland, the black sands of Kamchatka, the fjords of Norway, and the volcanic plains of North America all tell the same story, a story of balance, destruction, and rebirth. Fire and ice were never enemies. They were partners in creation. Together, they shaped the face of our planet, forged its diversity, and gave rise to life itself. The glaciers carved the canvas, and the volcanoes painted it with color. And though the age of ice had ended, its spirit remained in the quiet hum of the Earth's molten core, in the frozen peaks that still crown the poles, in the cycles of warming and cooling that continue to shape our future. The war between fire and ice had no victor, for both were the same force, life-changing form. And in the silence that followed their clash, the world was new again. The ice had melted, the fire had dimmed, and from the balance between them, a new dawn began to rise, the dawn of a planet reborn. The world was changing faster than ever. The age of ice was fading, and with it, the mighty beasts that had ruled the frozen plains were beginning to vanish. The earth was awakening into warmth, and for the giants who had thrived in the cold, every sunrise brought them closer to their end. The mammoths, once the architects of the tundra, now walked through lands that no longer belonged to them. The snow that had once crunched beneath their massive feet melted into soft mud. The winds that had carried frost now whispered with warmth. The endless grasslands, their ancient feeding grounds, were shrinking, swallowed by growing forests. Trees rose where open plains had once stretched for miles. The mammoth steppe, their kingdom, was dying. The mammoths were creatures of cold perfection. Every part of them had been crafted by the ice, their thick fur, their layers of fat, their blood adapted to survive freezing temperatures. But now, those gifts became burdens. The same warmth that allowed forests to bloom made the giants overheat. They could no longer travel as far. Their food, the tough, frost-hardened grasses, was replaced by plants they could not digest easily. Hunger followed wherever they went. In the melting world, the balance that had held for millennia began to collapse. As the climate shifted, animals that had relied on the cold vanished in waves. The woolly rhinoceros, unable to find open tundra, disappeared from Europe. The saber-toothed cat, once the terror of the plains, could no longer hunt in the thick forests. The cave lion, the giant ground sloth, and the short-faced bear all began to fade into history. The planet that had shaped them was leaving them behind. For the mammoths, survival became a desperate journey northward toward Siberia, toward Alaska, toward the last strongholds of ice. Herds that had once roamed across continents were now scattered and small, isolated by rivers and rising seas. The great migrations that once thundered across the tundra were silent now. Where once hundreds had walked, only a handful remained. And in the shadows of the forests, another species watched, clever, patient, and relentless. Humans had changed too. They had followed the mammoths through centuries of cold, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their movements. For generations, the mammoth had been their source of life, meat for food, bones for tools, fur for warmth, tusks for art. But now, as the herds dwindled, the relationship between human and mammoth shifted from respect to necessity. With the warming of the earth came new tools, new strategies. Humans learned to craft long, slender spears tipped with flint and obsidian. They built traps and coordinated hunts with precision and communication, unlike any creature before them. They had mastered fire, shelter, and teamwork. But more importantly, they had mastered patience. In the tundra, a herd of mammoths moved across a valley, their fur glowing orange in the dying light. Among them, a young calf stumbled beside its mother, its small trunk swinging clumsily. From the ridge above, hunters watched silent, motionless. They waited for the wind to shift, for the moment when the herd was most vulnerable. When it came, they struck like ghosts. Fire, noise, and fear rippled through the air. Spears flew. The giants turned to run, but the melting ground trapped their feet. Chaos erupted, cries of terror, the sound of splintering bone, and the heavy crash of falling mammoths. When the silence returned, the valley was red with life's final offering. To the humans, this was survival. To the mammoths, it was extinction. Scientists still debate whether humans alone caused their fall or if climate sealed their fate first. But perhaps it was not one or the other, perhaps it was both. A partnership of forces, one natural, one intelligent, working together in unintentional destruction. As the climate warmed and the world changed, humans simply became the final push. The mammoth's disappearance was not sudden. It came like the fading of a song, slow, mournful, inevitable. Each generation saw fewer and fewer of them. Legends formed around their memory. Their bones became sacred relics, their tusks carved into stories. In the minds of the humans who had once hunted them, the mammoths became spirits of the past, the giants who had taught them survival. But the story did not end everywhere. On a small island in the Arctic Ocean, known today as Rangel Island, a few mammoths survived long after the rest were gone. Isolated by rising seas, they lived on, shrinking in size as resources dwindled. They were smaller, weaker, but still mammoths, the last echo of a vanished world. For thousands of years after their kin had perished, they walked the frozen shores, unaware that they were the final survivors of an age. Then, around 4,000 years ago, when humans in Egypt were building pyramids, the last mammoth took its final breath. With it, the line of the Ice Age giants ended, but their legacy endured, written into the bones of the earth. Every hill, valley, and plain still bore their mark. The mammoths had ploughed the tundra, spread seeds, shaped ecosystems. Even in death, they had fed the soil, enriching it for the forests that came after. Their extinction was not just an ending, but a transformation, the old world giving way to the new. And as the mammoths vanished, humans began to rise. Freed from the harsh grip of the ice, they expanded into the warming lands, building communities, growing crops, and taming animals. They had survived the greatest test nature had ever given, and now they were ready to take command of the earth. Yet deep within the human mind, something was lost with the giants, a sense of awe, a reminder of the vastness of nature, the power of the earth that had once humbled them. The disappearance of the mammoths marked the first time humans had witnessed the extinction of another species, and perhaps, though they did not understand it yet, the first time they were responsible for one. Millennia later, when scientists uncovered their frozen bodies from the permafrost, they found them perfectly preserved skin, hair, and even the contents of their stomachs intact. It was as though the ice itself had refused to let them go, holding on to their memory for the future. Through these remains, we came to know them not as myths, but as reality. And now, in our time, the story of the mammoth continues once more. Deep in laboratories, scientists have begun to study their DNA, seeking to bring them back through the art of cloning to revive the great beasts that once ruled the frozen earth. Whether this is wisdom or hubris, no one can say. Perhaps it is humanity's way of seeking redemption, of undoing the silence we helped create. The fall of the giants was not only a story of extinction, it was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when the world changes faster than life can follow. The mammoths, the rhinos, the saber-tooths, they were not defeated by weakness, but by a planet in transformation. They were victims of time itself, and yet, in another sense, they never truly left us. Their bones became our bridges to the past. Their memory became part of our imagination. Their strength, part of our myth. They live on in stories, in science, in the very landscapes they once shaped. The fall of giants marked the end of an era, the final chapter of the Age of Ice. But it was also the beginning of something new, an age where one small, fragile species would rise to fill the void left behind. Humankind had watched the world freeze and thaw, had seen fire and ice collide, had survived when others could not. And now, in the quiet left by the fallen, they stood alone at the dawn of their own dominion. The giants had fallen, but their echo would guide us forever. The end came not with thunder or fire, but with water. Slow, patient, unstoppable water. For thousands of years, the ice had been melting, drip by drip, carving channels through mountains, feeding rivers that grew wider and stronger with every season. The frozen grip that had held the world in silence began to loosen, and as the first great floods roared across the continents, the age of ice finally began to die. The transformation was vast and violent. Whole glaciers, once miles thick, broke apart and slid toward the sea. The air filled with the sound of collapse, a sound like mountains shattering. From the Arctic to Antarctica, walls of ice taller than cathedrals cracked and fell into the ocean, sending shockwaves across the water. These were the final breaths of an ancient empire, and the seas rose to claim what the ice had stolen for millennia. In the north, the Laurentide ice sheet, once covering nearly all of Canada and parts of the United States, began to retreat. Enormous lakes formed at its edges, trapped behind walls of ice. And when those walls broke, the floods that followed were beyond imagination. Rivers of meltwater cascaded across the plains, carving deep valleys and shaping landscapes that still exist today. Lake Agassiz, the largest of these, was a sea in itself, stretching over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. When it finally burst, it unleashed torrents that drowned forests, swept away mountains of earth, and changed the course of the Mississippi River forever. The same story unfolded across Europe and Asia, as glaciers collapsed and ancient rivers returned to life. The planet, once frozen, and still became a world of motion. Waterfalls thundered from cliffs that had been buried under ice for ages. New lakes formed in the craters left behind. Sediment from the melting glaciers spread across the land, turning barren tundra into fertile soil. Where mammoths once grazed, wildflowers began to bloom. But with beauty came chaos. As the ice vanished, the planet's balance shifted. The oceans, swollen by meltwater, swallowed coastlines. Entire land bridges disappeared beneath the rising tides. The Bering Land Bridge, which had once connected Asia and North America, was gone, sealing the migration paths that humans and animals had used for generations. The North Sea filled, drowning the plains that connected Britain to mainland Europe. The world's shape itself was changing. To those who lived through it, the change must have felt like the end of time. Imagine the sound: constant rushing water, endless rain, thunder, as ice cracked open. The sky was heavy with moisture, dark and restless. The sun, though warmer now, brought storms that lasted for weeks. Lightning split the horizon, illuminating forests that had never known such heat. The earth was trying to find a new rhythm. Humans adapted, as they always had. They followed the retreating ice, moving into valleys newly exposed by the thaw. They found caves that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years, filled with the bones of animals long gone. In the warming plains, they hunted new species, deer, bison, aurochs, and learned to fish the rivers that now flowed where glaciers once stood. With the warming came abundance. Plants grew faster, animals returned, and for the first time in generations, food was plentiful. Humanity began to stay in one place, no longer wandering endlessly after the herds. They built shelters from wood and stone instead of bones. They discovered that seeds, when planted, could grow into food. The first gardens took root in the soil, left behind by the melting glaciers, the beginning of agriculture. The first step toward civilization. The age of survival was ending. The age of creation was beginning. But the planet's transformation was far from peaceful. As the glaciers withdrew, they left behind scars, vast scars, carved into the bedrock, filled now with the restless movement of water. Earthquakes shook the earth as the pressure of the melting ice lifted from the continents. Volcanoes erupted once again, their flames licking the sky. The world groaned as it remade itself. In the oceans, the changing balance of salt and temperature disrupted the great currents that carried heat around the globe. The Gulf Stream, weakened by floods of fresh water, faltered. For a brief moment, no more than 1,000 years, the warmth reversed, temperatures plunged, and the world froze one last time. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, the Earth's final breath of ice. The return of the cold was swift and cruel. Forests withered, rivers froze, and animals that had adapted to the warmth found themselves trapped once again in hunger and frost. It was as though the planet, in its grief, tried to undo its own transformation. But the ice could not hold. The warmth returned, stronger than before. The glaciers melted once more, this time for good. Seas rose higher than they had in hundreds of thousands of years. Islands vanished, coasts shifted, and the outlines of the continents began to resemble the world we know today. For the mammoths and the last of the Ice Age giants, this was the end. Their herds, already small, could no longer find the cold they needed to survive. Their food vanished, their young grew weak, and the warmth overtook them. Within a few centuries, they were gone. The humans who had once hunted them now lived in their shadow, the memory of their size and strength lingering in myths and carvings. The giant bones unearthed in later generations would be mistaken for dragons, for gods, for monsters of legend. In truth, they were the remnants of a world that had simply become too warm for them to exist. The meltdown reshaped not just the land, but the future of all life. Forests spread across Europe and North America, covering the plains in green. Deserts expanded elsewhere as rainfall patterns shifted and monsoons drifted. Animals evolved rapidly, filling the empty spaces left behind by the extinct. Humans multiplied, spreading across every corner of the earth. And with the warmth came time to think, to build, to dream. Fire, once used only for warmth, became a tool of creation. Humans used it to harden clay, to cook, to forge metal from stone. They began to build communities, the first villages, the first symbols of permanence. And in the soil left behind by the glaciers, they found life's renewal. The rivers that flowed from the melting ice became the lifelines of civilization. The Nile, the Tigris, the Indus, the Yangtze, along their banks, humanity planted its roots. The water that had once destroyed now nourished. The same melt that had ended an age had birthed another, the age of man. But the earth remembered. Deep beneath the forests and oceans, the cold still lingered. Glaciers remained in the highest mountains, and at the poles, silent reminders of what once was. And inside those glaciers, time was frozen. Air from ancient skies, pollen from vanished fields, the DNA of creatures long gone. The planet had preserved its own memory, waiting for a time when someone would listen. Thousands of years later, we did. Scientists drilled into the ice sheets, reading them like scrolls written by the Earth. They learned how the world had breathed, how it had frozen and thawed in perfect cycles. They discovered that each degree of warmth and cold carried consequences, that every choice the planet made echoed through millions of lives. The story of the meltdown is not just one of destruction, but of transformation. It is the story of how endings become beginnings, how death feeds life. The ice did not vanish in vain. It left behind everything we are. In the silence after the floods, the world was reborn. The glaciers retreated to the poles. The forests grew tall. The air became rich with oxygen. The sky clear and blue. Birds returned in endless flocks. Fish swam through thawed rivers, and the land, once barren, flourished in colour. The age of ice had ended, but the memory of it remained carved into the bones of the planet and into us. The Earth had melted, yes, but it had also awakened, and in that awakening, the story of humanity, the next great chapter, had begun. The ice had melted, the glaciers had retreated, and the world was reborn in green. Where once the earth was silent and white, it now sang the sound of rivers flowing through valleys, of wind rushing through forests, of animals calling in the warmth of a new sun. The long winter that had defined existence for hundreds of millennia was over. From the cold ashes of the Ice Age rose something entirely new, a world of balance, abundance, and light. This was the beginning of the human dawn. As the ice withdrew to the far corners of the planet, the lands it left behind were rich and fertile. Thick layers of mineral dust, ground by glaciers and spread by wind, covered the plains. It was the finest soil the world had ever known, and it called to life like never before. Grass spread first, painting the tundra in green. Then came the forests, vast and untamed, stretching across continents. Trees that had once been stunted by frost now grew tall and strong, covering the scars left behind by the melting ice. For animals, it was paradise. Herds of deer, bison, and aurochs roamed the valleys. Wild horses thundered across the plains. Birds returned in swarms, filling the sky with colour and motion. Even the predators flourished, wolves, bears, and big cats reclaiming their hunting grounds. But this time, they were not the only masters of the earth. Humans had survived the ice by moving, adapting, and enduring. They had watched entire worlds vanish beneath the cold, and yet they had remained clever, persistent, and united. Now, as the warmth spread, they stepped forward into the sun. The first generations born after the Ice Age did not know the silence of endless snow. To them, the earth was alive, and they were its children. They built their camps beside the rivers left behind by the glaciers, where fish were plentiful and the soil was soft. They hunted less and gathered more, learning that the plants around them could feed them as surely as the herds once had. The great shift had begun from hunter to settler, from wanderer to builder. It started slowly. A handful of seeds dropped near a campsite sprouted the following season. People noticed, remembered, and began to plant more. Wheat, barley, lentils. The first gardens were small, fragile, but revolutionary. For the first time in history, humans had control over food that didn't walk away. Fire, once a weapon against the cold, became a tool for creation. It cleared fields, baked clay into pottery, hardened wooden tools. The smoke that rose from their hearths was no longer just a sign of survival, but of civilization. In the Fertile Crescent, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, small groups began to settle permanently. They built round huts from mud and straw, their walls thick against the wind. They raised goats and sheep, creatures once hunted, now domesticated. Their days followed the rhythm of the sun, their lives tied to the seasons. The first villages appeared like sparks in the wilderness. Jericho in the Levant, Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, Jarmo in Mesopotamia. Each was born from the same truth. The world was warm now, and it was theirs to shape. For the first time, humans began to think beyond the next hunt or the next winter. They began to plan years ahead, to build for generations. They stored grain in clay jars, saved seeds, and began to understand time not as a cycle of survival, but as a path forward. And with stability came imagination. The people who once painted mammoths and lions on cave walls now painted the patterns of life, the sun, the moon, the harvest. They carved gods from stone, their faces both human and eternal. They looked at the stars and began to wonder not just where they were, but why they were. Language grew richer, memory longer, and stories deeper. They told tales of the great ice that had covered the world, of giants that once walked the plains, of floods that had reshaped the land. Their myths were not fantasy, but memory echoes of the Ice Age carried in the blood of their ancestors. The forests, once their enemies, became their allies. From wood, they built tools, homes, and boats. They learned to navigate rivers, to fish in deeper waters, to cross lakes that the glaciers had left behind. The world was connected now by water, and humanity followed its flow. In Europe, tribes followed the receding glaciers north, discovering lands newly uncovered by ice. Scandinavia, once a barren sheet of frost, now bloomed with green valleys and shining fjords. In Asia, humans followed the great rivers eastward, populating the vast steppes. In Africa, where the ice had touched least, people continued to flourish. Their lands warmed, their savannas filled with life. And across the Bering Strait, now lost to the sea, the descendants of Ice Age hunters spread through the Americas, reaching lands no human had ever seen before. Everywhere they went, they carried the memory of the cold, the instinct to prepare, to adapt, to endure. And so they thrived. The air itself seemed to breathe differently now. The thick dust of the Ice Age had settled, and the atmosphere grew rich with oxygen. Rain returned to the deserts, rivers cut through new valleys, and the planet became more hospitable than it had been in millions of years. This was the Holocene, the age of humans. The same world that had tested them now welcomed them. The glaciers, in their retreat, had given humanity the gift of a stable climate, gentle seasons, fertile land, and predictable rain. It was this calm that allowed civilizations to rise. In the warmth of this new age, the human mind expanded beyond survival. Music was born. Rhythm came first, the beating of hands against wood and skin. Then melody, sung around fires as the night faded into morning. Art evolved from cave walls to sculpture, from symbols to stories. People began to record their lives at first with carvings, then with marks, then with words. And slowly, humanity became aware of itself not as a part of the world, but as something apart from it. They had conquered the ice. They had outlasted the beasts. They had turned nature's fury into knowledge. But even as they rose, the memory of struggle remained buried in their bones. It was the reason they built walls, the reason they stored food, the reason they feared the cold. The ice had taught them never to trust the warmth completely. And so, even in paradise, they prepared for its loss. They watched the seasons carefully, marking the position of the sun and the phases of the moon. They built calendars, monuments, and stone circles, early observatories like Göbekli Tepe, where the alignment of stars became sacred. Time itself became a tool, measured and understood. The same curiosity that had guided hunters now guided thinkers. As humanity multiplied, the world began to change again, but this time by human hands. Forests were cleared for farms, rivers dammed for irrigation, stones stacked into walls and temples. The earth that had shaped them was now being reshaped by them. And in that transformation, the story of life entered a new chapter. The ice had sculpted their resilience. The fire had forged their will. And now, in the warmth, they discovered creation. But even as they built, the planet continued its quiet rhythm, breathing in warmth, exhaling cold. It was patient, timeless, and though the age of ice had ended, the cycles that governed it had not. One day, far beyond their lifetimes, the Earth would cool again, the glaciers would return, the balance would shift, but for now, in the fleeting warmth of this moment, humanity stood on the threshold of eternity. The sun rose higher in the sky. The forests rustled with life. The rivers carried their reflection downstream. This was the dawn of humankind, born from ice, shaped by struggle, and destined to inherit the earth. And somewhere, deep beneath the polar ice that still remained, the echoes of the frozen world slept quietly, waiting for the day they would be remembered again. The ice was gone, and in its absence, the earth exhaled. The cold that had ruled for millennia was retreating into memory. Rivers ran where glaciers had once slumbered, and grass burst through soil newly freed from frost. The silence of the frozen age was broken by the hum of insects, the cries of birds, and the rustle of leaves. The planet was alive again, reborn in green, and in this new warmth, humanity began to awaken. They had survived the age of monsters and storms, endured hunger and frost, and hunted the giants that once ruled the world. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had been wanderers, children of the ice, moving endlessly in search of food, fire, and shelter. But as the cold faded, so too did their need to roam. The melting world offered stability. The earth, for the first time in human memory, was kind. The end of the Ice Age was not the end of struggle, but it was the beginning of something extraordinary, the birth of civilization. As the great glaciers withdrew northward, they left behind rich valleys filled with dark, fertile soil, earth ground fined by ice, nourished by minerals and meltwater. Seeds that had once drifted aimlessly on frozen winds now took root in this new ground. The first grasses sprouted, followed by flowers, trees, and crops. Humans, once hunters, began to watch the cycles of the land. They saw the patterns of the seasons, the return of rain, the growth of plants, the migrations of animals, and they began to understand that the world was no longer shifting beneath their feet. It could be trusted. It could be tamed. They learned to plant, to harvest, to stay. Small groups settled along riverbanks, building shelters not from bones or hides, but from wood, clay, and stone. They shaped tools for farming, hoes, plows, baskets. They stored food, saved seeds, and discovered that the earth could provide more than it ever had before. In the fertile crescent of the Middle East, along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, early humans began to cultivate wheat and barley. In Asia, rice sprouted in flooded fields. In Africa, the banks of the Nile shimmered with green. Each region gave rise to its own beginning, but all shared the same truth. The warmth had changed them. The dawn of agriculture was the dawn of time itself. For the first time, people could count the days, the passing of seasons, the rhythm of rain, the phases of the moon. They built calendars, aligned stones to the sun, and began to tell stories not of survival, but of belonging. Yet this new stability came with new challenges. Life had been simple under the ice: eat, move, endure. Now, humans faced questions they had never needed to ask. Who owns the land? Who leads the tribe? What happens when there is more than enough for some and too little for others? From these questions, civilization was born. Villages grew into towns. Towns became cities. Families became societies. Bound by cooperation, trade, and shared belief, humans began to build not just for survival, but for legacy. They carved symbols into stone, painted their gods on walls, and raised monuments to the skies. And all the while, the memory of the ice remained the stories of cold and endurance passed down through generations. In every culture, echoes of that age appeared. Tales of floods, of frozen darkness, of the great beasts that once roamed the earth. Even as they tilled fields and built temples, humanity remembered the long winter that had forged their strength. The climate of the planet stabilized. The great cycle of freeze and thaw paused. And for the first time in millions of years, warmth endured. Animals flourished in the new world. Forests stretched across continents, teeming with life. The great herds of aurochs and deer replaced the mammoths. Wolves and humans formed a silent alliance, beginning the bond that would one day give rise to dogs. The oceans, too, transformed. Coral reefs bloomed in the warmth, filling the seas with color and life. Rivers carved through plains, creating the deltas that would become cradles of civilization. The Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, each one born from the melt of glaciers, each one giving birth to human culture. It was in these places that writing appeared, the first human attempt to give permanence to memory. Symbols etched into clay and stone told stories of kings and gods, of harvests and stars. Humanity had moved from surviving the world to recording it. And as knowledge grew, so did ambition. The stars that had once guided hunters across the tundra now guided sailors across the sea. Constellations became calendars, the heavens became maps. The fire that had once kept the cold away now forged metal, powering a new kind of progress. The human dawn was not without its darkness. With abundance came desire, and with desire came conflict. Lands were fought over, cities built and destroyed, rulers rose and fell. But beneath it all, the same force that had carried humans through the Ice Age remained adaptability. When rivers changed course, they moved. When crops failed, they learned. When disaster struck, they rebuilt. They had inherited the resilience of the mammoth, the cunning of the wolf, and the patience of the cold itself. And though they no longer saw glaciers on the horizon, the memory of those walls of ice lingered in their bones, a quiet warning of how fragile balance could be. In the centuries that followed, humanity spread across every continent. They crossed deserts, sailed oceans, climbed mountains, once covered in ice. Their tools grew sharper, their homes stronger, their dreams larger. They tamed fire, but also lightning. They painted caves, but also skies. Civilization was the child of the Ice Age, a creation born from hardship, tempered by the extremes of nature. Everything that humans became thinkers, builders, explorers, was forged in the crucible of the cold. And even now, thousands of years after the last glacier melted, the Earth still carries the memory of that age. The valleys, the fjords, the lakes, all bear the marks of ancient ice. And within us, the descendants of those who walked through frost and fear, that endurance still lives. The Ice Age had ended, but its spirit had not. It lives in every story of survival, in every fire built against the dark, in every wall raised to protect against the unknown. It lives in the human will to adapt, to rebuild, to begin again. The dawn had come. Humanity stood on a warm, living planet, beneath a sky unclouded by snow. The age of ice had tested them, shaped them, and in the end, given them everything. And as the sun rose over the first human fields, glinting off rivers born from melting glaciers, the world, once silent and frozen, sang again. The ice was gone, the giants were gone, but life, resilient and endless, remained. And from the ashes of cold, a new age had begun, not of survival, but of civilization. The age of ice had ended, but its shadow lingered across the face of the earth. Though the glaciers had melted and the mammoths were gone, the world still carried the memory of frost. Mountains bore the scars of retreating ice. Valleys curved where rivers of frozen time once carved through stone. And beneath the green and gold of the new world, the ancient cold slept silent, patient, eternal. Even in warmth, the planet remembered. Beneath the soil, frozen bones lay hidden, perfectly preserved in permafrost, the remains of a world that had never truly died. Mammoth tusks gleamed like buried ivory suns, and inside their marrow, traces of life endured, microscopic but unbroken. The ice had captured everything: air from forgotten skies, pollen from vanished fields, the scent of forests long turned to dust. Each frozen layer was a page in the Earth's diary, written in silence, waiting to be read. The glaciers had retreated to the poles, but their breath still cooled the winds. The great ocean currents, born during the Ice Age, continued to weave heat and cold around the planet, keeping the climate alive. The air we breathe, the rain that falls, the rhythm of the seasons, all of it is shaped by the echoes of that frozen time. It was the Ice Age that had built the world as we know it. It had carved the continents, sculpted the lakes, and shaped the rivers that humans now depended on. The fertile lands of Europe, Asia, and America were gifts from its retreat. The soil that fed the first farmers was born from glacial dust. The rivers that watered the first civilizations were born from its melt. Even the mountains that divide nations still bear the lines and grooves of its passage. To most, the ice is gone, a relic of myth and science, but in truth, it never left. It lingers in the highest peaks, in the poles, in the frozen heart of Antarctica and Greenland. And there, beneath miles of compacted snow, the ancient world still breathes. Scientists drill deep into these ice sheets, extracting slender cylinders of history, ice cores that hold secrets of the past. Trapped in their bubbles are the whispers of time. Volcanic ash from ancient eruptions, soot from forest fires long forgotten, and the faint traces of carbon from the breath of mammoths and humans alike. When melted, the water that drips from them is millions of years old, a liquid memory of a colder Earth. Each layer tells a story. The thickness of snow reveals the seasons of abundance and famine. The ratio of gases reveals warmth and cold. By reading these frozen archives, scientists can see the heartbeat of the planet, the rise and fall of temperature, the cycles of ice and fire that have guided life for billions of years. And what they've learned is simple yet profound. The Earth never truly stops moving between extremes. Every age of warmth, gives birth to cold, every age of ice gives birth to life. The planet breathes in balance, an endless cycle of creation and destruction. For humanity, the echoes of the ice are more than geological. They are biological, woven into our very being. The endurance that kept our ancestors alive in the frost still shapes us in our hunger for survival, our instinct to adapt, our need to plan ahead. Our fears of scarcity, our drive to build, even our stories of apocalypse, all are reflections of the cold that once ruled us. We still carry the memory of fire against the dark, of gathering together in caves, of watching the endless snow deep in our subconscious. We still hear the wind of the tundra. It is why we fear silence, why we crave light, why we never stop searching for warmth. And though the world has changed, those instincts remain as strong as ever. But the echoes of the ice are not only found in memory, they are visible in the world around us, in the landscapes, in the animals that survived, and in the shifting balance of the climate. Reindeer still migrate across the tundra, following ancient routes carved by their ancestors. Musk oxen graze the same windswept plains that once trembled beneath the steps of mammoths. In Antarctica, penguins huddle together as their distant ancestors once did in the prehistoric cold. And in the northern forests, the thaw of permafrost begins to release what the ice has hidden for millennia: the bodies of ancient animals, the spores of forgotten plants, even bacteria and viruses older than civilization. The past is awakening, released by the warmth of the present. There is a quiet warning in that. The same warmth that once freed humanity from the ice now threatens to undo the balance it left behind. Glaciers shrink again, seas rise, and storms grow stronger. The echoes of the ice are no longer silent. They whisper through the wind and water, reminding us that the Earth's cycles never stop, that we live between the remnants of one age and the beginning of another. But this is not merely a story of loss. It is also one of resilience. The planet endures, as it always has. Just as the mammoths once walked through blizzards, just as early humans faced starvation and survived, the world adapts. Life finds its way always. The echoes of the ice remind us that nothing on Earth is permanent, that every comfort we know was carved from struggle. The warmth we enjoy was born from fire and frost. The lands we walk were built from glaciers and time. Every river, every mountain, every breath of air carries the imprint of that frozen age. And in the midst of all our progress, the ice still calls to us. It exists in the poles, untouched and ancient, holding the memory of who we were before we built cities, before we tamed fire, before we named the stars. The frozen Earth is the planet's soul, a mirror that reflects not just what the world was, but what it can become again. When we look at the ice, we are not just seeing the past, we are seeing the story of everything that made us. And perhaps that is why we cannot look away. In every human heart lies the memory of cold, of survival, of unity, of endurance. The Ice Age taught us to fear the dark, but it also taught us how to build the light. It made us creatures of balance, capable of destruction, but also of creation. The echoes of the ice still guide us in our art, in our curiosity, in our need to preserve what came before. For in understanding the past, we understand ourselves. The world has thawed, but the lesson remains: nothing is eternal and everything is connected. The frost that once covered the earth still lingers beneath our feet. It hums beneath the mountains, glows within glaciers, and whispers in the wind. And someday, when the warmth fades again, as it always has, the ice will return, slow and quiet, reclaiming what it once owned. For the story of Earth is not of beginnings or endings, but of cycles. And in every cycle, the ice waits patient, remembering eternal. The world we know was shaped by ice, and though the glaciers have long since retreated, their legacy remains written across every landscape, in every breath of air, and in the memory of every living thing. The frozen legacy is not just the story of the past, it is a reminder that the planet never forgets. Beneath the continents, deep within the permafrost, the Ice Age still sleeps. It lies hidden beneath the tundra of Siberia, under the Greenlands of the north, and in the heart of Antarctica, where time moves slower than anywhere else on Earth. There, in the frozen silence, the remnants of a vanished world remain the bones of mammoths, the pollen of extinct flowers, the traces of a planet both alien and familiar. The ice has preserved everything. Each frozen layer is a time capsule, a fragment of an Earth before civilization. Inside the oldest glaciers are bubbles of air from millions of years ago, the ancient atmosphere, trapped and untouched. When scientists drill into these frozen cores, they are not simply studying ice. They are reading the breath of history. The air that once passed through the lungs of mammoths still exists within the ice. The ash from volcanoes that erupted during the Pleistocene still drifts in microscopic layers. Even the faint residues of human campfires, the soot of ancient survival, linger in its crystalline veins. To touch that ice is to touch the story of life itself, a memory that has waited patiently for us to listen. And now, in an age far warmer than the one that birthed us, humanity has begun to uncover the frozen world in ways never imagined. As the permafrost melts under rising temperatures, long-buried creatures emerge: mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, even the bodies of humans frozen in perfect stillness. Their fur remains soft, their eyes still intact, their last meals still resting inside them. It is as if the ice, reluctant to let go, preserved them against time itself. Scientists carefully study these remains, extracting DNA from their bones and hair. Through this, the once impossible becomes real, the chance to bring them back. In laboratories around the world, researchers now work to decode the frozen genes of mammoths, splicing fragments into the DNA of modern elephants. Their goal is not to resurrect the past for spectacle, but to restore balance to the ecosystems that once thrived under the mammoth's rule. They call it de-extinction, the attempt to revive life that time has erased. Some see it as hope, others as hubris. Can we truly rewrite nature's story? Or are we repeating it, trying once again to shape forces older and wiser than us? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between reverence and responsibility. For as we melt the ice that preserved the memory of our planet, we are awakening the consequences of our own warmth. The frozen ground, once our silent ally, now releases gases, methane and carbon that were trapped for eons. The very earth that gave us life begins to stir beneath our touch, reminding us that every action echoes through time. This, too, is part of the frozen legacy. The Ice Age was not only an era of cold, but of balance. It tested life, refined it, forced evolution to adapt and endure. It was a sculptor, harsh but necessary, that shaped the resilience of every species that followed. And from that test, humanity was born. We owe our existence to the pressure, the scarcity, the silence of that frozen world. And though the ice is fading now, its lessons endure. The first is that life survives by change. Every creature that lived through the Ice Age did so not through strength, but through adaptation. When the cold came, they grew fur. When the warmth returned, they shed it. When the mammoth vanished, humans learned to farm. Survival was not defiance, it was acceptance, a dance with the rhythm of the earth. The second is that nothing truly disappears. The mammoths are gone, yet their bones feed the rivers. Their dust enriches the soil. Their image lives in our myths, their genes inside the elephants that still walk the earth. Extinction is never silence, it is transformation. And the third lesson is humility. The same cycles that created us can unmake us. The earth has frozen before, and it will freeze again. It has warmed before, and it will warm again. We are part of that pattern, not outside it. Our civilization may seem powerful, but against the quiet persistence of ice and time, we are fragile. Still, within that fragility lies wonder. Because the ice does not only preserve death, it preserves beauty, frozen flowers, still vibrant after tens of thousands of years. The footprints of animals pressed into once soft mud, now immortalized in ice. The tiny, delicate wings of insects caught mid-flight, their patterns flawless, untouched. These are the silent poems of the planet, reminders that even in endings there is grace. And so we study the ice. We preserve it. We travel to the poles. We drill into glaciers. We watch them crack and groan under the heat of a changing world. And as we do, we listen to what it's trying to tell us. Perhaps it is saying, remember me. Remember the age when the world froze and life refused to die. Remember the fire that kept you alive. Remember the balance that once sustained everything. For in the memory of the ice lies the wisdom of the earth that nothing is permanent and yet nothing is truly lost. The Ice Age ended 10,000 years ago, but its spirit endures. It lingers in the DNA of the animals that survived, in the rivers born of its melt, in the stories whispered by our ancestors to their children. It remains in the glaciers that still crown the mountains, glowing blue under the weight of time. It remains in the frozen oceans, in the breath of the Arctic wind, in the deep silence that falls over the poles each winter. The frozen legacy is everywhere, in the shape of the continents, in the rhythm of our seasons, in the resilience of life itself. And though we live in an age of warmth and light, the ice is never truly gone. It waits in the dark, in the high peaks and deep seas, holding the planet's memory in its glassy embrace. Someday, far into the future, when the world tilts again, when the balance shifts, the cycle will begin anew. The snow will fall longer, the seas will retreat, and once more the earth will be wrapped in white. And when that day comes, the descendants of those who survive, human or otherwise, will look upon the frozen world and find within its silence the same truth we know now, that from the cold, life begins again. The ice does not end things, it preserves them, and through it, the story of the earth and of us will never truly end. When mammoths roamed, the true story of the Ice Age, the frozen legacy, the final echo of a world that shaped us, a world that still breathes beneath our feet.